Good evening. Good to see you. Nadine in Germany just showed up. Hi, Nadine. So we are about to begin our next class. And as we have done before, we're going to begin with a recitation of the Heart Sutra. And you may notice that this Heart Sutra is all about emptiness. Although, even though we've talked a bit about emptiness so far in this course, you may not recognize what exactly is being talked about. So as we go along in the next couple of classes, we'll mention the connection with that. But Sunny, why don't you put up that, here we go. And I'm going to, oops, there we go. So, thus did I hear at one time, the Bhagavan was dwelling on massive Vulture's Mountain in Rajagriha, together with a great community of monks and a great community of bodhisattvas. At that time, the Bhagavan was absorbed in the concentration on the categories of phenomena called profound perception. Also, at that time, the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokiteshvara looked upon the very practice of the profound perfection of wisdom and beheld those five aggregates also as empty of inherent nature. Then, through the power of Buddha, the Venerable Shariputra said this to the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokiteshvara. How should any son of the lineage train who wishes to practice the activity of the profound perfection of wisdom? He said that, and the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokiteshvara said this to the Venerable Sharidvatiputra. Shariputra, any son of the lineage or daughter of the lineage who wishes to practice the activity of the profound perfection of wisdom should look upon it like this, correctly and repeatedly beholding those five aggregates also as empty of inherent nature. Form is empty. Emptiness is form. Emptiness is not other than form. Form is not other than emptiness. In the same way, feeling, discrimination, compositional factors, and consciousness are empty. Shariputra, likewise, all phenomena are emptiness, without characteristic, unproduced, unceased, stainless, not without stain, not deficient, and not fulfilled. Shariputra, therefore, in emptiness, there is no form, no feeling, no discrimination, no compositional factors, no consciousness. No eye, no ear, no nose, no tongue, no body, no mind. No visual form, no sound, no odor, no taste, no object of touch, and no phenomenon. There is no I element, and so on, up to and including no mind element and no mental consciousness element. There is no ignorance, no extinction of ignorance, and so on, up to and including no aging and death, and no extinction of aging and death. Similarly, there is no suffering, origination, cessation, and path. There is no exalted wisdom, no attainment, and also no non-attainment. Shariputra, therefore, because there is no attainment, bodhisattvas rely on and dwell in the perfection of wisdom. Their minds without obscuration and without fear. Having completely passed beyond error, they reach the endpoint of nirvana. All the Buddhas who dwell in the three times also manifestly, completely awaken to unsurpassable, perfect, complete enlightenment in reliance of the perfection of wisdom. Therefore, the mantra of the perfection of wisdom, the mantra of great knowledge, the unsurpassed mantra, the mantra equaled to the unequaled, the mantra that thoroughly pacifies all suffering, should be known as truth, since it is not false. The mantra of the perfection of wisdom is declared, Tadyata, Gate, Gate, Para Gate, Para Samgate, Bodhi, Spaha. Shariputra, the Bodhisattva Mahasattva, should train in the profound perfection of wisdom like that. Then the Bhagavan arose from that concentration and commended the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokiteshvara, saying, well said, son of the lineage, it is like that. It is like that. One should practice the profound perfection of wisdom, just as you have indicated. Even the Tathagatas rejoice. The Bhagavan, having thus spoken, the Venerable Sharidvatiputra, the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokiteshvara, those surrounding in their entirety the world of gods, humans, asuras, and Gandharvas were overjoyed and highly praised as spoken by the Bhagavan. Okay, thank you. So here's Paul and Richard, Georgiana, Karen, and a lot of people who have put off their video reasonably. So this is Snehi. Good evening. Before we begin, does anyone have any lingering questions from the last class? How are we doing? I can't see anyone's hand up. No? Okay. Okay, so we're talking about the practice of emptiness, which in this case means the way to realize emptiness, which we've heard is very, very important. As was mentioned in the text before, it is not possible to even escape from cyclic existence without realizing emptiness. This is according to, to Lama Tsongkhapa's tradition, the Gelugpa tradition. Some other traditions who follow some lower tenets say it is possible to escape from cyclic existence without realizing emptiness, but you need, excuse me, you need to realize emptiness to achieve enlightenment. Lama Tsongkhapa's position, based on Chandrakirti and Nagarjuna's teaching, says that you can't even escape from samsara. You can't become an arhat without realizing emptiness. So those kind of subjects will be, those topics will be dealt with in the longer course that will be starting in June on Lama Tsongkhapa's commentary and the Chandrakirti's text, the entering into the middle way, the Madhyamaka avatar. So in our text, we have the fifth Dalai Lama has mentioned that some of the lineage gurus have proposed this simple entry into analysis of emptiness. There are many ways to realize emptiness, different logical reasonings you can use. The reasoning of dependent arising and the Vajra slivers and so forth and so on. But this is what we're talking about here is sort of like the what do you call it? This cornerstone of a building. What is that called? When you start a building, you put this big boulder in the corner and you build around that. What's that called? Anyone know?
Keystone?
Keystone. Described like the keystone. This is giving sort of a general synopsis of how one goes about it. And we've mentioned briefly in the past, I'll just go over again. The point is there are four essential points here in this explanation. One, the first essential point that we've talked about over the last two classes is called identifying the object of negation. So the object of negation in this case is the assumed existence of an inherently existent I. So that there's an appearance to your mental consciousness when you get rid of all of the other distracting thoughts. Well, even if you don't get rid of the distracting thoughts, the appearance is there, but you don't notice it so much. But to identify it, you need to be able to calm the mind and concentrate and notice how the I is appearing. That appearance is not the immediate object of negation here. It's called an ultimate object of negation, because when you achieve Buddhahood, there won't be any appearance from your own side of inherent existence, but the object of that grasping, there's an appearance of an I, there's a consciousness that is apprehending it. To that appearance, it's like if we see a rabbit outside with two ears, the rabbit is like the appearance, And the eye consciousness looking at the rabbit is like this other, is our mental consciousness apprehending that appearance of an inherently existent eye. The belief in a rabbit having horns is like the grasping of the mind, believing that appearance is really true, thinking that it really is inherently existent. So that was the point that we've talked about before, the first essential point. Second essential point is called ascertaining the pervasion. So what that means, that's what we're going to talk about today in more detail. The third essential point, so the pervasion is of two kinds. If that eye existed the way that it appears as inherently existent, it would either have to be inherently one with the aggregates, or what can we say, identical to the aggregates, or it would have to be different than the aggregates. The aggregates meaning the five aggregates of form, feeling, discrimination, compositional factors, and primary consciousness. Those are called the five aggregates, right? If the I existed, it would have to be either identical to the aggregates or different than the aggregates. Not just identical and different, it would have to be inherently identical, because it's seeming to be inherently existing from its own side, or would have to be inherently different. That word is important to understand, that qualifying word. So that's the first essential point, was identifying the object of negation, then establishing the pervasion, which we're going to be going about today, and then refuting each of those two possibilities, that it is not inherently one with the aggregates on one hand, and then once you've determined that, realizing that it is not inherently different than the aggregates. It couldn't be inherently different than the aggregates. It couldn't be inherently one with the aggregates. It couldn't be inherently different than the aggregates. So the pervasion was that if it existed, it would have to be one of those two, right? If it existed, it would have to be one of those two. Once you've eliminated the possibilities through the third essential point and the fourth essential point, that it is not, it can't be inherently one with the aggregates, it can't be inherently different than the aggregates, that leaves you with the conclusion that it doesn't exist at all. An inherently existing I, if it existed, okay, the important word there, if it existed, it would have to be inherently identical to the aggregates, you could say inherently one with the aggregates, or it would have to be inherently different than the aggregates. Those are the only two possibilities. Eliminating those two possibilities undermines the initial kind of premise that if it, you know, I say this is not a premise, if it existed, it would have to be one of those two. So because it's not one of those two, it doesn't exist. That's the gist of these four essential points. Okay, make sense? Okay, some people nodding. Okay, Larry, what do you think? That doesn't make sense to you. Why not?
It seems to me that the second refutation, that it depends on the aggregates, is a conventional truth.
What did you say? The second, what did you say? The second what?
Refutation, that it can't exist apart from the aggregates.
Okay, so there are four essential points. The first was identifying the object of negation, establishing the pervasion, then showing that it's not inherently one with the aggregates, and then finally the fourth point, it's not inherently different than the aggregates. So you're saying what you're talking about is the fourth essential point, right?
Yeah.
You're saying that that cannot be established, or that can only be established conventionally, or what do you think?
Established conventionally. Because it's dependent.
Yeah, it's dependent on the aggregates, right? And in
Yes.
fact, all of these things, all of these reasons only exist conventionally. None of them exist
Right.
ultimately.
Right,
No phenomena exists ultimately.
right,
So that just reaffirms that you're using the conventional mind to establish these facts. There's no problem with that, because there's no way to establish these facts with ultimate analysis.
right,
Okay. In fact, this is called ultimate analysis. Ultimate analysis is looking for the object in the basis of designation. What's the basis of designation?
skandhas.
The skandhas, the five skandhas, the five aggregates. So you know that word maybe from other texts. Skandha is a Sanskrit word that we translate as aggregates. The Tibetans say pungpo, sort of like piles, heaps. They go sometimes translated as the five heaps. Sort of the origin of that is like if you were to take a car apart, you could put all of the steel in one heap. You know, you put all of the glass, like the windshield and other things, in another heap. All of maybe the rubber of the wheels and maybe the leather in another heap, if there's leather or cloth, and the petroleum you could put in another heap, right? You could put a bunch of heaps that are of similar qualities. You know, the metal heap and the glass heap and so forth. So these skandhas, you could translate skandha as heap or aggregates. They are the basis. There's no basis for the person other than the five skandhas, the five heaps. Okay. So does that help a little bit, Larry?
Huh?
Does that help a little bit?
Yeah.
Okay, so we'll come back to that in the fourth point. So we finished last time with this statement. This is the first essential in the cultivation of wisdom: ascertainment of the object which is negated in the theory of selflessness. Okay, we talked about that in detail. You should analyze until deep experience of it arises. What experience? The recognition of that object, the ascertainment of it, that you're recognizing the object that is to be negated. So the main object of negation here is called the object of negation of reasoning, and that is the supposed reference of this appearance. There's an appearance of an eye that can't be denied right now on the conventional level. The eye appears to your consciousness in meditation. But what the mind is believing that refers to, the way that it looks like it's existing from its own side inherently. That supposed existence, inherent existence that the mind is believing, that's called the object of negation of reasoning. The consciousness that's believing it also is an object of negation, in the sense that it will slowly be negated and eliminated through the course of becoming an Arya being and progressing through the bhumis, through the levels of the Bodhisattva path, until you've ceased all of that grasping to the self. So that's also called an object of negation. I think it's called the object of negation of experience. I'm not sure. Ultimately, even the appearance of the eye, it will be dispensed with when you achieve enlightenment. That's called the ultimate object of negation. But so the main object of negation here is the supposed existence inherent existence of the I, existing in the way that it appears in consciousness, okay? You should analyze until deep experience of it arises, having generated such in your mental continuum, in your mind, the continuum of your mind, you thereby crystallize an identification of the I conceived by the inborn conceiver or the innate conceiver of an I as being self-established and as having a relation with your own aggregates like that of water put into water. We talked about this last time. Okay, does that make sense to you? So, identification of the I conceived by the innate or inborn conceiver of an I. So that inborn conceiver or innate conceiver is this, the consciousness, the way the consciousness is grasping to that, conceiving that. Does it believe it or not? Okay, it sounds like Ripley, believe it or not. And having a relation with your own aggregates like that of water put into water. So that's an expression that comes up in other contexts. Like water put into water. Sometimes we talk about milk put into water. So what it's talking about here is that there is no differentiation between that self and the aggregates. It's as though it is intermingled with the aggregates, and there's no distinction of it from them. This is a subtle point, because when you've actually recognized the object of negation, at that point, the aggregates are not appearing to you, but it's as though in your own mind, you are not differentiating that self from the aggregates. If such an identification crystallizes, comes about, mere analysis will cause you to attain ascertainment of the non-inherent existence of the I. That means just a simple analysis of these last two of the ascertaining the pervasion, ascertaining that it's not one with the aggregates, that it's not inherently different than the aggregates. That's the analysis that's talked about here. That sounds like a lot of work to be done, but that if you're familiar with those concepts, that could be done in a very short time. That's why it's saying here, if such an identification crystallizes, if you recognize the object of negation, mere analysis, simple analysis, will cause you to attain ascertainment, that is, to realize the non-inherent existence of the I. The non-inherent existence of the I is called selflessness, right? The selflessness of the person. It's the emptiness of the person, of your own self. If you do not identify such an I, if you don't have the first essential point, analysis falls apart without ever getting started. Okay, that's more or less where we finished last time. Now, starting from here is beginning to talk about the second essential point. Do you remember what the second essential point is called? Richard, do you remember? What is it called?
Establishment of the pervasions.
Ascertaining the pervasion. Right?
Ascertaining the pervasions.
Yeah. So here he quotes Chandrakirti's clear words, the Prasanapada. Chandrakirti wrote many commentaries about emptiness, but two commentaries he wrote about Nagarjuna's text. Nagarjuna's fundamental text is called Fundamental Reason. Fundamental Wisdom. Was it Saweshara? Yeah, Saweshara. Mula Prajna. Mula, I mentioned last time in Dharamsala, the root institute, is called, the locals call it mula, it means root or fundamental. So mula prajna, that's Sanskrit. Sawe Sherab, Sawa means root, Sherab means wisdom. So he wrote 2 commentaries on that. One is the one that we'll be teaching starting in June, called the Madhyamaka Avatar. That's a meaning commentary, not going over every verse in order of Nagarjuna's text, but giving the general meaning. But he wrote another text about each verse in succession, going over every word of them, called a word commentary. That's the Prasanapada, the clearly worded, or the clear words. So Chandrakirti's clear words, commentary to Nagarjuna, says, consider whether the object of a conceiver of a self is the same as the, and Jeffrey's added the words here, mental and physical. They're not in the actual Tibetan text. As the same as the aggregates, or is something different than the aggregates? Does that make sense? Now that we've talked about these words before, consider whether the object of self-grasping, what's the object of self-grasping? The self-grasping mind, or the conceiver of a self, it's not conceiving of the appearance, it's conceiving of what the appearance seems to be. It's conceiving that appearance to be an inherently existent self, right? Alex, what do you think? What's the innate conceiver? Consider whether the object of a conceiver of a self, that means the innate conceiver of the self, is the same as the aggregates or is different than the aggregates. What's the conceiver of the self? And what's its object? So the conceiver is the mind's reaction to the appearance. And it is looking at that appearance, so to speak, knowing that appearance, and conceiving it to be inherently existent. Thinking that it exists the way it appears. It's inherently existent. So that inherent existence is the object of that conceiver. Okay? Barbara, what do you think? Does it make sense? So Chandrakirti says that, consider whether the object of a conceiver of a self is the same as the aggregates or is something different than the aggregates. The words mental and physical there, Jeffrey added just to make it more easy to understand. So it's talking about the 5 aggregates. So with regard to this, so that comes in Chandrakirti's Prasanapada. So one text which is Lama Tsongkhapa wrote as a commentary to Prasanapada is this text, Ocean of Reasoning. I mean, this is the translation of it in English by Ngawang Samten and J. Garfield. So the section that this is talking about comes, if you happen to have this book, on page 372 in this edition. At the bottom of the page, it says, if the self, the object of self-grasping, right? So in our text here, it says, consider whether the object of self-grasping, here it says conceiver of a self, that means self-grasping. If the self, the object of self-grasping, existed inherently, one could not escape 2 alternatives regarding its mode of existence. Thus, we should analyze to determine whether it, through its own characteristic, sort of through its own inherent existence, is identical to, that is the same as, or different from the aggregates. So this is setting out this pervasion. What is it? You know what pervasion means? In logical terms? Like, say, for instance, if you say, the room was pervaded by incense smoke. What does that mean? Ida, what would I mean by that?
Covered with smoke.
covered with folk everywhere, right? So a pervasion means that it is a necessary, it is something that covers all alternatives. If the object of self-grasping existed inherently, one could not escape two alternatives regarding its mode of existence. Thus, we should analyze to determine whether it through its own characteristic, that's the important thing, like inherently, is identical to, means same as, or different from the aggregates. Of identity and non-identity, of sameness and difference, when one is eliminated, the other is affirmed by that elimination. Thus, a third possibility is excluded. So there can only be two alternatives. If two things existed, there's no third possibility. They either have to be identical or they have to be different. They can't be, if they're partially the same and partially different, they are different, right? So sameness means, well, let's say when we talk about these two terms in Tibetan, chik dang tade. Chik means one or same. What do we call identity here? Tade means different, separate. So generally in the collected topics that are studied before one enters into all of these topics about reasoning and so forth, in that context, we talk about even say, for instance, dog and perro. Did I pronounce that right? How do you say dog in Spanish?
Perro.
Perro. Okay, that's good. Okay, you get a bit better. Dog and perro, are they the same or different? Whoever said perro, was that Ida? Who pronounced it for me?
Adriana.
Adriana. Okay, Adriana. Are dog and perro the same or different?
Well, they're the same, conventionally, but in different languages sounds different, but they're the same. Perro and dog.
Right.
Yeah.
So they are actually different because they have different names. To be the same, they even have to have the same name. Okay.
Oh.
But here that's just a general presentation in the collected topics, so called dura, one and different. For two things to be identical, they have to be identical in all respects, even by name. But here we're using that concept a little bit differently, because we're talking about a supposed self. We don't have to give the name self, okay? That object of self-grasping. We don't know what it is. We tentatively give a name to it. We want to know if it's the same as the aggregates or different than the aggregates. Okay. The important thing to add here is because that self appears to be inherently existent, established from its own side, if it existed, it would have to be inherently one with the aggregates, inherently identical to the aggregates, or it would have to be inherently, by its own nature, would have to be different than the aggregates. Okay, those are the only two possibilities. You might, like I said before, if you try to think, oh, well, there's some other possibility, maybe it's partially the same and partially different. If it's partially the same and partially different, it's different, right? Because it's not identical. Okay, so continuing, the I appears as if not distinguished from the mental and physical aggregates, which themselves are not differentiated. So in the Tibetan text, this is a little bit, Jeffrey's done a good job of translating, but it's a little bit difficult there are a couple of different ideas that are coming there. The I, that means the object, not just the appearance of the I, but the object that you're conceiving it to be. The I appears, that's the appearance. The I appears as if not distinguished from the mental and physical aggregates. It's not as though you can say it's different than the physical and mental aggregates. It seems to be sort of immersed into them, which themselves, the five aggregates, are not differentiated. That is, when you're imagining this object, the inherently existent I, it seems to be immersed like water into water with the aggregates themselves, in this context, not being differentiated. They themselves seem to be just the five aggregates, or you say the aggregates. Ida, you have a question?
Just a comment. If there was no differentiation of the I, then there would be no need to designate an I. It would just be another designation for the aggregates.
Right.
Am
right.
I going in the right direction there?
Right. If there was, if the I were identical to the aggregates, here we're talking about the aggregates themselves to this mind which is grasping to the I. The aggregates at that point are not differentiated. You're just thinking of an amalgam of the aggregates. Okay. Let me go a little bit further. The I appears as if not distinguished from the mental and physical aggregates, which themselves are not differentiated. However, the one thing such as a pot is not said to be separate or undifferentiable from itself. Here, the Tibetan word is shi, it means the basis. So this is a little bit, this section a little bit complicated. So a pot, if you just talk about pot, is not separate or different from itself, its basis. And here he says, here with respect to the I, there arises aspects of a basis of designation, the five aggregates, and a phenomena designated upon those five aggregates, imputed to those five aggregates. That is aggregates and I. Okay, so the I is imputed or designated to the aggregates. So parenthetically, he mentions here this thing about a pot is not said to be separate or undifferentiable from itself, right? So this parenthetical phrase is explaining that a pot can be considered as a phenomena designated, and the bottom, the belly, and the top of the pot as being its basis of designation, right? You've heard this old joke I mentioned in our attendance class some months ago. Sometimes they say the definition of a gesh, here the definition of a pot is that which says flat base, round belly, and ability to hold water, something like that, right? So they say a geshe is defined as having a flat bottom, round belly, and ability to hold water, maybe a long neck also, something like that. This is kind of a joke, right? Playing on this definition of a pot. So a pot can be considered as a phenomenon designated, and its basis that you designate it to is the bottom, say the flat bottom, the belly, and the top of the pot, the neck, as its basis of designation. So on the basis of seeing these parts, these aggregates, so to speak, the basis of designating a pot, you can impute upon that, give the name pot. But pot alone is not considered under these aspects. If you don't talk about a particular pot that has aggregates, if you just talk about pot, it's not considered under these aspects. So here earlier where it said, however, the one thing such as a pot is not said to be separate or undifferentiable. That would mean same, right? Undifferentiable. Differentiable would be separate, right? Undifferentiable would mean same in this case. From the basis. That's talking about pot in general, as in this parenthetical phrase at the beginning, at the end here. A pot can be considered as a phenomena designated, and the bottom, belly, and the top of the pot as his basis of designation. But pot alone, that's what's being talked about in the first part of the sentence, is not considered among these aspects. But when we talk about the self here with respect to the I, there arise the aspects of a basis of designation and the phenomena designated. That is the aggregates and the I. What's the basis? The 5 aggregates. What do you designate to those 5 aggregates? What do you impute upon them? The I. So that's not talking about, that phraseology is not talking about the way that the innate conceiver is conceiving of the I. This is just talking about the I and the aggregates in general. The aggregates are the basis for designating the I, and the I is that which is designated, the designated phenomena, the daksha. Hence, it is to be analyzed, continuing here, it is to be analyzed whether the I, which is inherently self-established, doesn't exist, right? Is an I which is inherently self-established exist? No. Maybe we should say, hence it is to be analyzed whether an I which appears to be inherently self-established in relation or on top of the 5 aggregates has some other way of existing other than oneness or difference, separateness from the aggregates. You have to analyze, if the I were inherently existent, is there any other way that it could exist other than being identical to the aggregates or separate from the aggregates? Using different words, identical to the aggregates, one with the aggregates, or different than the aggregates. That's what you have to analyze in order to establish the pervasion. You have to check in your own mind. If the I were inherently existent, self-established, in Tibetans, it's suk tuk tu juba. Suk means set up. So suk means set up. Tupa means able. Juba means established. So established is as though able to set itself up. It's one of the many synonyms or theoretical synonyms of inherent existence. I mentioned in our, for those of you who did Tenet's course some months ago, they're called theoretical synonyms. Anyone know? Maybe Paul knows from other studies, like inherent existence, self-existence, inherent existence from its own side. Existence is as though able to establish itself. Why are they called theoretical Synonyms. You remember, Nadine? For two things to be synonyms, they both have to exist. None of these things exist. So they're like synonyms because they're all referring to the same non-existent thing, but they can't be actual synonyms because inherent existence, true existence, existence from its own side, existence is as though able to set itself up. There's even several more. None of them refer to something that actually exists. So they're just called theoretical synonyms. Okay. Hence, it is to be analyzed whether the I, whether an I, which appears to be inherently self-established, it doesn't say that here, it says which is inherently self-established. I wanted to say which appears that way because there is no I which is inherently self-established. In relation to, in Tibetan it says tengdu, which means on top of the five aggregates, has some other way of existing other than oneness or separateness from the aggregates. So you check, if an I were to be inherently existent, is there some other way that it could exist other than being inherently one with its basis of designation, that is the aggregates, or inherently different than those? This is called establishing the pervasion. Snehi, you're reading, you're thinking, what do you think? Does it make sense? On one level, it sounds simple, right? But if you think about it, what do you think?
I am still like processing.
Yeah, processing. Okay, that's what I should have said. You're looking at this and processing, thinking. So what you have to say in general, when I talked earlier, when you talk about two things, if two things existed, they would either have to be the same or different. Remember when we talked about, the sameness would have to include even the name. So even dog and perro would be different because they don't have the same name. Okay, so here we're talking about an implementation of that idea to this particular circumstance. So what we have is a situation where we know that the I is something which is designated to the aggregates conventionally. Okay, that's one factoid. You know, the basis of designation of the five aggregates, the I is what is named or imputed or designated to those five aggregates. So it says here, it is to be analyzed whether the I, which is inherently self-established in relation to the five aggregates, has some other way of existing other than oneness or separateness from the aggregates. Through taking other phenomena as an example, in the end, you will realize that there is no third category of existence. As I was reading from Lama Tsongkhapa's commentary to that, that verse of identity and non-identity, that means sameness or difference, or same or separate. When one is eliminated, the other is affirmed by that elimination. There is no third possibility. Thus, a third possibility is excluded. So that means there's a pervasion. If it existed, it would have to be identical to the aggregates or different than the aggregates. And because it appears to be inherently existent, it would have to be inherently one with the aggregates or inherently different than the aggregates. Okay. Some people are nodding. Some people are processing. I'm not sure what David's This is, what is that? That's processing also, I think, right? Snehi, what do you think?
I had a question. You know that sentence that says, through taking another phenomena as an example, what is that referring to? In the end, you will realize that there is no third category.
Right. So for instance, if you talk about, so in the lower tenets, if you talk about a flower, okay, a flower that is a metog, something that grows from the ground, not what you make pasta from. A flower is said to be substantially existent according to the lower tenets. It just appears to yourself, yet other phenomena, like say a rosary or an army, are said to be imputedly existent. So we talk about two different kinds of categories: substantially existent phenomena that you can name anything. You don't have to name it flower, right? Just like the moon. The moon has many different names. You don't have to call it moon. You could call it Chandra, the Sanskrit word for moon, right? Chandra, like Chandrakirti, famous moon. You can call it the bearer of the rabbit. That's kind of an Indian way of saying it. Do you know where that comes from? Does anyone know why the moon be called that? Paul, you know. What is it?
Because if you look at it, you like in Europe, they say the man in the moon, but if you look at the moon with the right sort of perspective, you can actually see a rabbit.
Right. It's kind of like, depends on the latitude and longitude and so forth. In India, it was that they didn't talk about a man in the moon. It looks like, if you look at it from those latitudes and longitudes, it appears as though there's a shape of a rabbit in the moon. So the bearer of the rabbit, you could call it, there's no, if something is substantially existent for the lower tenets, you can name it anything. Okay, you can give a name to anything. But if you talk about imputedly existent phenomena, like a rosary or an army, or a forest, let's say. Why is a forest said to be not substantially existent? Because if you just see one tree, you can't impute forest to that. You have to see all of the parts. Seeing one soldier in town, you can't impute army legitimately. You have to see the troops together. You can't impute rosary to one flower or one bead of a, rosary that we say prayers on. Rosary also can mean, a circle of flowers, right? I mean that also. Tengwa in Tibetan. So through taking other phenomena as an example, in the end, you will realize there is no third category of existence. So here, going beyond that, if you're talking about something which is, let's see, some other way of existing other than oneness or separateness from the aggregates. So is the army one with the soldiers, the parts, or is it different than the soldiers? Is there any other way of existing? Is a rosary existing one with its parts, identical to its parts, or is it different than its parts? What do you think? Who can I ask? Kristen is processing. Adriana is processing. Barbara, what do you think?
I'm definitely processing.
Processing. Okay, so let's read the sentence again. Through taking another phenomenon as an example, in the end, you will realize that there is no third category of existence. So that's talking about the phenomena itself. In this case, the I. The example we have, the I and its basis of designation. So in the case of the army, it would be the name army, the concept of army, and its basis of designation is the collection of a group of soldiers large enough to call army. I don't know, maybe it has to be a certain number of soldiers or something like that. If the army existed, it would have to be either one with its parts, one with its basis of designation. So the parts and basis of designation are interchangeable here, right? The army has parts, or those parts, the various soldiers are the basis upon which you designate the name army, right? So is the army have any other way of existing as either identical to its parts, the soldiers, or different from the parts? So something to analyze, something to check. So what he's saying here is, through taking another phenomenon as an example, rosary, forest, army, and so forth, things that in the lower tenets are called designatedly existent, imputedly existent. For Prasangika, Madhyamaka, all phenomena are imputedly existent. All phenomena that exist conventionally. No phenomena exists inherently, right? If anything exists, it exists imputedly or conventionally, right? As given a name to a collection of parts. So thinking about that, I'm not sure if John is processing. John, are you processing? I think he's. So.
Venerable, this is
Yes.
Barbara. This reminds me of set theory in math. It's either
Okay.
part of the set or it's not. This is Barbara.
Oh yeah, okay, I see. The green lines around your space there. Say again. So it reminds you of set
This
theory.
reminds me of math when you have set theory.
Yes.
It's either part of the set or it's not. There's
Yeah.
no third.
Yeah, maybe you could say that. Here it's going a little bit further though. It's saying it's either identical to the set, because we're presupposing something, two things are either identical or different. If it's different, if the two, say if you had Venn diagrams, if they weren't completely concentric, if they weren't identical, even if they were mostly identical, they'd still be different. Right? Who was raising their hand? Hillary, were you raising your hand?
It seems it's easier to understand that an army or a rosary is merely imputed because you can see all the different parts, right? But with a person or a pot, they physically appear to be one thing, whereas a rosary and an army don't appear to be one thing. I mean, it's easier.
Right. So so in the lower tenets, that is the differentiation that's made. They say that
Uh-huh.
things where you don't have to see all the parts are said to be substantially existent.
Right.
That's not the terminology used here, but when they talk about things where you have to see the basis of designation, it's not sufficient to see just one part of it. Those are called imputedly existent phenomena. So we're using that terminology as a stepping stone to understand what's being talked about here. When you talk about, so let's read this again. This is what Geshe Zopa used to say. This is what he called chewing the dry bones. Right? At first, you think, I'm going to go over that sentence again. This is, in order to digest this, you have to sort of look at all of the words and try to understand what's being said. So here, it is to be analyzed. The Tibetan actually has a kind of a preface, hence it is to be analyzed whether the I, which is inherently self-established, if such a thing existed, in relation to or on top of the 5 aggregates, has some other way of existing other than a oneness or a separateness from the aggregates. This is establishing the pervasion. If it existed, it would either have to be identical to the aggregates, one with the aggregates, oneness with the aggregates, or separate from the aggregates. In other words, different than the aggregates. That there is no third possibility. This is something that you have to establish through your own investigation. If you can establish that certainty of that, then the following, then when you can eliminate that it is not inherently one with the aggregates, and subsequently, it is not inherently different than the aggregates. You don't have to do them in that order. You can first investigate whether it's different than the aggregates and then whether it's the same. Doesn't matter the order. But once you've eliminated those two, because there was a pervasion, there was a necessity that it would have, if it existed, it would have to be one or the other. When you've seen that neither of those cases occurs, it's not one with the aggregates, it's not different than the aggregates, then you would come to the conclusion, therefore it doesn't exist. Because if it existed, it would have to be one of those two. Richard, what do you think? Makes sense? Somewhat. Georgiana?
Yeah, no, completely.
Oh,
Makes
okay.
perfect sense.
Georgine?
I understand.
Okay, yeah, that's what I would say. I understand, but you still have to process. You still have, so this point of establishing the pervasion is some mental and logical work that the person who wants to realize emptiness has to first undergo. You have to analyze the situation. If the I were to inherently exist, it would have to be, because you're talking about inherent, if it were to inherently exist, it would have to be inherently one with the aggregates or inherently different than the aggregates. Make sense? Makes sense, but maybe you haven't reached absolute certainty of that. Ascertainment means reaching certainty of that. Okay, so think about that. This is called the second essential point, establishing the pervasion. So the pervasion means a necessity that if it existed, it would have to be either one or the other. And if it's not one or the other, that means it doesn't exist. So that would be a good conclusion, that you could conclude that what you thought was inherently existent didn't really exist. Okay, kind of makes sense? No? This is the strategy. The decision that the I and the aggregates are either the same or different is the essential or the essential point of ascertaining pervasion. Ascertaining pervasion, ascertaining the pervasion, reaching certainty as to the pervasion. In Tibetan, this is kappa ngepe nge. Nge, ne, not nge, ne means the essential point. That last word, kappa means pervasion, ngepa means ascertaining, ne means essential point. So the essential point of ascertaining the pervasion, and that is, if the I exists, maybe we should preface it, if an inherently existent I exists, it is either inherently one with or inherently separate from the aggregates. Being either of those pervades or occurs with every existence, every instance of an existent I. So what about the conventional I? Is the conventional I identical to the aggregates or different than the aggregates? Karen, what do you think? Conventional I. Conventional David, your dear husband. Is he conventionally one with his aggregates or conventionally different than the aggregates? We're talking about the conventional I, not the inherently existent.
Right. So conventionally he exists, but he wouldn't conventionally exist one with the aggregates, right? Because his aggregates change.
Right, that's one kind of thing, yeah. Also, the aggregates are 5.
Right,
so
so
forth.
which one? Yeah.
So he is the I which is imputed upon the aggregates almost by definition is different than the aggregates.
Okay.
The aggregates are the basis of designation or the basis of imputation. The I is that which is imputed upon it. So we say dakshi means the basis of designation. Dak, in this case, dak is not the same meaning as I, but imputed, it's different spelling. Dakshi means the basis of imputation, and dakcha is the object which is designated, the phenomena which is designated. Conventionally, they would be, you could come to the conclusion that they're different, right? But when you talk about an supposed inherently existent I, because you don't know that it exists. You know that David exists conventionally, and so you can come to the conclusion that the conventionally existent David is different or separate than his aggregates. You can come to that conclusion. But in the case of an inherently existent I, you don't know yet. You're investigating whether such an inherently existent I exists or not. So you can't go from that assumption that it exists. So reading on, previously, the I, the phenomena designated to the aggregates, right, conventionally, which are the basis of designation. You're beginning to recognize these phrases now? The phenomena designated, the I is the phenomena designated, the daksha, and the aggregates, which are the basis of designation, the parts, in other words, the dakshi, they seem to exist as if self-established and indistinguishable from the aggregates. Previously, the I, the phenomena designated to the aggregates, which are the basis of designation, seemed, so what is seemed? The I seemed to exist as if self-established. Before you do this kind of analysis, it seems to be self-established. That means inherently existent, able to set itself up, and indistinguishable from the aggregates. So when you were previously means when you first were identifying the object of negation. At that point, that I, the object of self-grasping, seems to be self-established, inherently existent, and indistinguishable from the aggregates. You can't say that it is the form aggregate, the feeling aggregate. It's just sort of like the aggregates is an amalgam. The I is somehow mixed with them. Through having practiced this second essential point, that is ascertaining the pervasion, the former consciousness, ascertaining the appearance of I, cannot remain as it is. How was it before when you identified the object? It was as though the I seemed to be inherently existent and indifferentiable, inseparable from the aggregates. Now, and there arises a little doubt about whether the I is the same or different than the aggregates. Before, it wasn't even a question. It was just that the I seemed to be indistinguishable from the aggregates. Yermepa means how do we translate Yermepa in other contexts, Paul? Yerme means inseparable.
Inseparable, indivisible.
Inseparable, indivisible. Here he says indistinguishable from the aggregates. So, you know, it's just sort of mixed in with the aggregates. Now, once you've investigated the pervasion, that if it did exist, it would have to be one with the aggregates or different than the aggregates, there arises a little doubt, some doubt about whether the I is the same or different than the aggregates. Following? I remember Geshe Darge, when we studied with him in India, he used to say that, you know, it's so worthwhile to analyze each and every word of the Dharma. You know, we at first, the first glance, we just try to get a general idea, but when you start to get down to understanding the particulars, it's very important to analyze each and every word. Leaves incredible imprints in the mind. In future lives, maybe even later this life, you will be able to see these things more clearly. So it says there arises a little doubt about whether the I is the same or different than the aggregates once you've established the pervasion. It's not sufficient just to doubt whether the I and the aggregates are the same or different. Okay, that's not going to bring about any kind of realization. Maybe it's the same as the aggregates. Maybe it's different. I'm not sure. A decision must be reached. In the case of the conventional self, you know, we're talking about, I was asking Karen, is David the same, conventionally the same or different than the aggregates? Decision can be made. It's definitely different than the aggregates, the self. It's something that's imputed upon them, okay? Here, it is not sufficient to doubt whether the self, the truly existent, inherently existent I and the aggregates are the same or different. A decision must be reached. Therefore, you should analyze thinking first that the I, which is conceived by the inborn conception of true existence. What does that mean? The I, which is, so there's the appearance of the I, that's not the I that's conceived. The I that's conceived is the object of the mind that's looking at this appearance of the I. to your consciousness. That appearance exists. But in watching that, like the example I gave so many times of Santa Claus, looking at that, how you conceive it. Do you conceive it as actually Santa Claus? Someone who's dressed up like Santa Claus, or do you conceive that that's not Santa Claus? So you should analyze thinking first that the I, which is conceived by the inborn conception of true existence, might be one with the body and the mind. It might be one with the aggregates, because body and mind here is just a short way of saying the 5 aggregates. You can divide it. So if you say 5 aggregates, sounds like 5 things. If you say the form aggregate is body, and the 4 mental aggregates, feeling, discrimination, compositional factors, and primary consciousness, they are mind, right? So you can say mind and body, or you can elaborate that into 5 aggregates. Therefore, you should analyze thinking first that the I, which is conceived by the inborn innate conception of true existence, might be one with the body and mind. Maybe it's that. That's now we're beginning the 3rd essential point. What's the 3rd essential point? It's investigating these 2 alternatives. The pervasion was that it had to be, if it existed, it would have to be identical with the aggregates or different than the aggregates. Now we're investigating whether it's identical with the aggregates or identical with the body and mind. Might be one with the body and mind. In that case, if it were one with the body and mind, in that case, the I could not be anything else other than anything except either one with the body or one with the mind. If it's going to be one with the body and mind, it either has to be one with the body or one with the mind. Generally, the body and the mind are different, right? Is the mind material? Alex, do you know? Impermanent phenomena are of 3 types. Do you know this, Alex?
I think I forget. Impermanent phenomena are 3 types?
3 types of impermanent phenomena: form, consciousness, and that which is impermanent, but neither form nor consciousness. Like, say, for instance, the person. Persons are impermanent, right? But persons are not mind. They're not body. They're called non-associated compositional factors. So 3 kinds of impermanent phenomena. Therefore, you should analyze thinking first that the I, which is conceived by the inborn conception of true existence, might be one with the body and mind. Okay, so you take that up. In that case, the I could not be anything else except either one with the body or one with the mind, because they are different phenomena, the mind and body. If the I were one with the body, it would not be correct, it would not be sensible to say my body. Why is that? If the I was one with the body, then you would say the I's body. Let's see, what does it say here? If the I were one with the body, it would not be sensible to say my body from the point of view of affixing an attribute body to the base I. Generally, we say my body, right? My head, my ear hurts, my nose is running. I and body are not identical. If the I were one with the body, it would not be sensible to say my body from the point of view of affixing an attribute, body, to the base I. Also, you would have to say my I, or the body's body, right? If the I were identical to the body, you would have to say, you know, if the body is the I, you would have to say, my I mean capital I, not EYE. Or the body's body, because the body and the I would be the same, identical. You couldn't differentiate between them, but there is a differentiation between I and, or, you know, self and body. Making sense? Some people make sense. Richard, what is your profession? Are you a mathematician? Philosopher? What are you?
Composer.
Composer. Oh, okay. Music composer? Oh, okay. I didn't know musicians would find this easy. That's good.
It's very interesting.
Yeah. In that case, the I could not be anything else other except either one with the body or one with the mind. If the I were one with the body, it would not be sensible to say my body from the point of view of affixing an attribute body to a base I. Also, you would have to say my I if the I and the body were the same, because the I is the body, right? My I, or the body's body. If the I is the body, you would have to say, in place of I, you would say body, the body's body. Generate ascertainment, certainty that it is the same also if the I were one with the mind. So in the same way, the I could not be, the inherently existent I could not be one with the mind in the same way. We'd have, you couldn't say my mind is hazy today. My and mine would be one. So you would have to say mine's mind is hazy today. Or I's eye is hazy today. You know, it's confused today. Generate ascertainment or certainty that it is the same also if the I were one with the mind. This is your homework. Go over this again later. Larry, what do you think? You're chuckling. You don't have, what do the Italians say? Coraggio. Be courageous. What do you think? What are you thinking? No thoughts? When I said you have to think about this and reach some certainty about this.
Right. At this point, at the first doubt, is the mind the same as the skandhas, as the aggregates?
Right.
Do you have to start differentiating between skandha or aggregate qualities and self qualities?
Okay.
For example,
say if we don't just take, he sort of abbreviates it here as mind and body. If you take 5 aggregates, you could say, if the I were one with the aggregates, it would either have to be one with the body aggregate, the form aggregate, or one with the feeling aggregate, or one with the discrimination aggregate, or one with the compositional factors aggregate, or one with the primary consciousness aggregate. The I would have to be one with any of those. Here he's breaking it up into mind and body, taking the 5 aggregates, dividing the form aggregate as body and the other 4 aggregates as mind. So it makes it a little bit more easy to investigate. But if you were to investigate, you could do the same thing with each of the aggregates and see there are different kinds of, what's it called? Not contradictory, sort of absurd consequences. If the I were one with the feelings, the feeling aggregate, there would be some absurd consequences also. Here, the absurd consequences he's bringing up are in regard to if you just take two, mind and body. Okay? Let's go a little bit further. If, having thought thus, your attempt at understanding is merely verbal, which is probably, if anything right now, our understanding is just verbal. That means, someone said, yeah, I understand. It's just saying you understand or something like that. If it's just verbal and you do not gain strong conviction, think the following. Think as what is said in Nagarjuna's fundamental text called Wisdom, the Mula Prajna. Prajna Nama Mula Madhyamaka Karika. Chapter 27, verse 27 says, when it is taken that there is no self except the appropriated aggregates, the appropriated aggregates themselves are the self. If so, your self is non-existent. This is what I said, and Geshe Darga used to say, you have to check every word, what's being said here. The Tibetan says, Newa lempa matokpe tak yomayin chepetse. When it is taken that there is no self except for the appropriated aggregates. So what does that mean? That means if you take into consideration there's no self other than the self that is one with the appropriated aggregates. What are the appropriated aggregates? Does anyone know? Nadine, you study. What are the appropriated? What does it mean, appropriated aggregates?
I think it has to do with the moment we take birth and when the consciousness appropriates. I'm sorry.
That's one of the meanings. We talk about the past. The past mind at the moment of conception enters into the fertilized egg and appropriates those aggregates, right? It's already consciousness, the previous consciousness. So you might say, how does it appropriate consciousness? It appropriates the gross consciousness once it enters into the fertilized egg, the gross consciousness that begins to appear. So they're called appropriated aggregates in the sense that the previous life appropriates them due to karma when it enters into that fertilized egg. They're called appropriated aggregates at the present because we consider the aggregates to be mine. We appropriate them. They're called appropriated aggregates in the future because we will, in future lives, we will appropriate them. Appropriate means, in Tibetan, newa lempa means take them, grasp, closely taking them. So they're called appropriated aggregates in various ways like this. So when it is taken that there is no self except for the appropriated aggregates. So that's just talking about if you consider that there's no I other than the aggregates, meaning the aggregates which are your present basis of designation, which you've appropriated in the past and you now consider yours. When it is taken that there is no self except for the appropriated aggregates themselves are the self. That means if there's no self other than them, the aggregates are the self. That is that they are identical, they are one, they're the same. If so, your self is non-existent. So what does that mean? So there's the sort of explanation of that. Because the I and the aggregates would be inherently one, what does it say here? When it is taken that there's no self except for the appropriated aggregates. They're one with the aggregates. The I and the aggregates would be inherently one. They would be one in all respects with utterly no division. Therefore, they would be none other than partless. You could not then present in relation to that partless one the two different things. The I, which is the appropriator of the five aggregates, and the five aggregates which are appropriated by it. Or you talk about appropriated here also is, you can talk about the I, which is the aggregates, which are the basis of designation, and the I, which is designated to them. It comes down to the same point. Therefore, an assertion of my body or my aggregates would be senseless. So why all of these different points? In order to come to a certainty and to have a realization that the I is not inherently existent, the I meaning the object that is believed in by the innate self-grasping, you need various kinds of reasonings. In essence, it is sufficient just to realize that it would either have to be inherently one with the aggregates or inherently different with the aggregates. And then seeing the absurd consequences of it being one with the aggregates or inherently different than the aggregates. But other reasonings are given. It's said that bodhisattvas, unlike the Shravakas and Pratyeka Buddhas, who, according to Prasangika, Madhyamaka school, they have to realize emptiness. Unlike the Pratyeka Buddhas and the Shravakas, who use just one simple reasoning to establish selflessness, the bodhisattvas have to be familiar with an ocean of logical reasonings that can be applied in different circumstances. Like there is no inherent coming and going, no inherent walking. There is no inherent birth and death. There is no inherent, four truths and so forth. Different kinds of logical reasonings have to be applied in these different circumstances. So the bodhisattvas who remain in cyclic existence for possibly 3 countless great eons, in order to not be overcome by the delusions, by the afflictions, has to be able to meditate on emptiness in many different ways. So here we're just getting a little taste of other kinds of things that can be brought up in your own analysis of this to reach certainty about this conclusion. I'm just going to read a little bit further, and then I'm going to go back to Ida, who had a question. She very kindly took down her hand a little while. Because the I and the aggregates would be inherently one, they would be one in all respects. The word inherently one is the important thing here. If they're inherently one from their own nature, from their own side, they would have to be one in all respects with utterly no division. There could be no division between the I and the aggregates. Therefore, they would be none other than partless. The I and the aggregates would be partless. You could not then present in relation to that partless one 2 different things, because being 2 different things, like the I, which is the appropriator of the aggregates, the owner of the aggregates, you know, my nose, my mouth, my tongue, and the aggregates which are appropriated by it. Therefore, an assertion of my body or my aggregates would be senseless. If this also does not get to the heart of the matter, if you still not convinced, think that because the I and the body are one, if they were one, after death, when the body is burned, cremated, is assuming you're cremated. Oh, you could say disintegrated, in the soil, in the buried and so forth. After death, when the body is burned, the I would also be burned. You might say, well, yeah, that makes sense. For someone who didn't believe in the existence of future lives, maybe they think, yeah, when the body's burned, the I is burned. Or, when the brain turns off, the I turns off. But here we're going by the assumption of Buddhism that there is a continuity of I. Just as the I and the body are one, after death, when the body is burned, the I would also be burned. Or just as the I transmigrates to the next birth, what Nadine was talking about before, when they, we say ningsam, that means joining, ningsam jor, joining the, from the intermediate state to the next life, that point of conception, when the subtlemost mind and wind enters into a fertilized egg, that's called transmigration. Just as the body, just as the I transmigrates to the next birth, this is the assumption of Buddhism, so the body would also have to transmigrate. If the I were the body, because the I transmigrates to the next life, the body would have to transmigrate to the next life. Is that right? Body doesn't, you leave the body behind, right? Or just as the body does not transmigrate, so the I would also not transmigrate, would not reincarnate, because the I and the body would be one. Consider the application of such fallacies. That's the word I was looking for before. Okay, so Ida, you had a question before. Do you still remember what it was?
Thank you, Venerable, for the teachings. Just a comment to corroborate what I'm understanding of that text you mentioned of Nagarjuna's. What I'm getting at is that once we analyze the body and all its parts, and we don't find the self, the I, and we analyze the mind and its parts, and we don't find the I, then there should be something left, right? An inherent I there. And I believe, obviously, there's no I left.
No, that's not right. So you don't investigate and look for the I in the parts. That is, His Holiness, the Dalai Lama has mentioned in various teachings. Sometimes you might think, say, he'll give the suggestion at the end of the discourse, look tomorrow, see if you can find the I in your body, in your eye, your nose, in your mind. That's not called ultimate analysis. That's not going to establish that the I does not inherently exist. That's something different. That's just an initial kind of investigation, whether you can identify the I as anything. Here, we're taking a particular logical fallacy that we're investigating. If the inherently, first of all, you have to identify the object of negation. That's much different than what the Dalai Lama is mentioning sometimes as a prelude to this. Investigate whether the I is in the in the body or the mind or the sinews or the liver or, the toe or, in your eyeball or in your eye consciousness. Here, the first point is first recognizing how the I appears to the subtlemost ignorance, which is called this innate self-grasping. That was the first essential point, right? Recognizing the object of negation. And as a result of that, knowing what qualities this hypothetical I that we've been believing in since beginningless time, what kind of qualities it would have. It would have to be inherently existing from its own side. If that were the case, that inherently existent I would either have to be identical to the aggregates or different than the aggregates. That kind of analysis is different than the analysis that you were just mentioning, looking for the I in the, without having identified it first, what the object of negation is. So let me leave that there. Let's see if anyone else has a question.
Well, just one.
Yeah, go on. Yeah, come.
Even in that subtle analysis, there isn't anything left. There is no I left. That's what was getting at. What's left over should be an inherent, truly existent self, but there's no such self to be found, even in that subtle analysis.
Yes.
Correct?
Yes. That conclusion that there is no inherently existent I to be found. We've only done the first part. It's not inherently one with the aggregates. You can do the same thing. It's not inherently different than the aggregates. When neither of those can be found, the only conclusion then is that the I that was believed in before to be inherently existent doesn't exist at all. So example I gave many times in the past, the lady going to the hotel in her nice dress, seeing her reflection in a door, glass door, off to the side, kind of a mirror, not seeing it as a reflection, just sort of out of the corner of her eye thinking, oh, there's another lady with the same dress I'm in. At that point, she's conceiving of another lady, right? That's wearing the same dress. There is no lady. Once she looks and she sees it's a reflection, she could realize there is no lady, other lady out there in the same clothes. At that point, the thing that she was fearful of before, or maybe jealous of, or at least interested in, that someone chose the same dress as her, that goes away completely. She sees that as empty. It doesn't exist at all. So at the end of that kind of analysis, all that appears to one's mind is a mere negation that doesn't exist. That inherently existent I that I believed before doesn't exist at all. You don't say it in words. There's not a conception of that. There's just the mere, what's called vacuity. The mere lack of what you believed in before appears to your mind. It's called space-like equipoise on emptiness, space-like meditation on emptiness. You're not thinking at that point, oh, the I, the inherently existent I doesn't exist, or there is no inherently existent I. You're not having any thoughts like that. You have just an apprehension of vacuity. The mirror, let's say like the lady that looked at the reflection in the mirror. When she saw there's no lady really there, there's sort of like an openness in the mind at that point. That the belief in that that lady in the dress no longer is seen as real. There's just a mere vacuity of that. That's what's being gotten at here. Okay, so I'm gonna remain a little bit longer, but Sunny, if you would put up the dedication prayers for those that need to leave more quickly. I think Nadine wants to get to bed. What time is it in Germany now, Nadine? 2 in the morning? 1:45, something like that? Sunny, could you put up the dedication prayer?
2:45.
2:45, yeah, oh my, 6 hours different, okay. So you want to get to bed. So we'll make a dedication. We realize that we've created some virtuous karma today, like the grist for the mill. We've with a good intention to benefit other sentient beings, we've analyzed these various words and concepts with the hope that in so doing, we may be able to realize emptiness, benefit ourselves and benefit others. So we've created a lot of virtues, virtuous karma. Due to these virtues, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead each and every sentient being without exception into that enlightened state. May the supreme precious bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow. And may that which has arisen not diminish, but increase more and more. So I'm going to remain a little bit longer. Those of you who have other things to do or sleep to get, you're welcome to leave. Anyone have another question? Adriana.
Thank you, Venerable Churinoff. I have a question. Is this inherently, or what appears to be inherent, existent I?
Good, okay, good to see you.
Is that the one generating, that is the one that generates and perpetuates the karma? Is
So
that
that doesn't exist at all, right? An inherently existent I doesn't exist, so it can't create anything. What creates the karma are deluded states of mind. We say klesha, or afflictions, delusions.
Okay.
Which come about because of the belief in that I.
Okay.
Because we still have that innate grasping to that I as really existing.
Yeah, okay.
I'm really important. You know, someone says some bad word to me. It's, natural for anger to arise, as the quotation from Aryadeva that just like the body consciousness pervades the whole body, ignorance means the ignorance that's grasping to that is truly existent, pervades all the delusions. That means whenever delusions arise, they always are pervaded by that ignorance. That ignorance gives them their rationale for legitimacy. It's okay to get angry because there is an I. It's okay to be attached because there is a real I,
right.
So forth. It's legitimate to get jealous, to be jealous because, I am inherently existent.
So is there a word to designate, is it consciousness then that moves from one rebirth to the other? Or what would be the word?
So we were talking about transmigration. So
yeah,
it's explained differently according to different schools of thought. If we talk about the highest school of thought, not just here, but also in Tantra, we say that at the time of death, all of the gross consciousness absorbs to the heart chakra, to the subtlemost mind and wind, prana. And at the time of death, when the karma to inhabit this body finishes, that consciousness leaves this body.
Yeah.
That is called death. That consciousness enters into what's called the intermediate state, the bardo, when it has a subtler mind that we have now and a subtler body. It's that subtlemost mind in wind immediately becomes a little grosser in the bardo, in the intermediate state. It has its own kind of form. Sometimes the form will be like the kind of rebirth that we are about to take. And it wanders around for some time until an appropriate fertilized egg, if we're going to take rebirth by, from the womb or even from an egg, there are different kinds of rebirth, until the appropriate situation arises, then it becomes a little grosser and it appropriates the aggregates by entering into the next life. That as Nadine was explaining the meaning of appropriated aggregates. It appropriates. You know what appropriate means? When the government appropriates your property. We say that, right?
Right.
So the taxman appropriates your you didn't pay or something, so they garnish your wages. It's sort of like appropriates, that takes for themselves your wages. So the mind appropriates that fertilized egg, and that is called rebirth, right? When it enters into that egg and becomes a gross, from that intermediate state, it had a very subtle mind, not the subtlemost mind. It has its own kind of slightly grosser mind than the subtlemost mind in wind, and it enters into the fertilized egg and appropriates them. That's called rebirth. Okay.
Thank you.
It's called transmigration. Okay. Jennifer, you have a thought, I think. Yeah?
Yes, thank you. A couple of questions, but I probably won't have time. The question is regarding the third essential point, investigating if the inherent I, is identical with the body and mind. And the part I get a little confused as is the premise: if it were one with the body and mind, it could not be anything else except one with the body or one with the mind.
Right.
And so, like, if you're using a conjunctive, like and, right? So
Right.
if it's one with the body and mind, but then all of a sudden you say, but it must be either, one with body or mind because they're different. And that
Right. So
logical.
if it were, so generally what we say is that the basis of designation of an I are the 5 aggregates. Here we're summarizing the 5 aggregates into 2, body and mind, right? So we're saying if it's one with the 5 aggregates, here we're saying if it's one with the body and mind, because the 5 aggregates would be the form aggregate and the feeling aggregate and the discriminate. So there's an and in between. But because that's a plurality, it couldn't be one with the body and mind because that's a plurality. If it were one, then the body and the mind would be one, right? So you investigate whether it's, because it can't be one with both of them, body and mind. It is one with the body or one with the mind.
Okay, not because they're different necessarily, but because of the plurality.
Yeah, and then you can even, not mentioned in our text here, you could just go in the same way. It's not one with the body because the body has many parts, right? If it were an inherently existent I, were inherently one with the body, there would have to be one, a body with no parts. It would have to just be hypothetical body, right? But you have parts, you have ear, nose, eye, tongue, so forth. In some cases, hair follicles. Mine are sort of gone. So even that alone seeing that if an inherently existent I existed, it would have to be either inherently one with the body or inherently one with the mind. Both of them have parts. Even the mind has parts. You have virtuous thoughts, non-virtuous thoughts, past thoughts, present thoughts, future thoughts. All of them could be said to be a multiplicity of parts of the mind. So even once you get familiar with this, you can start to see other fallacies like that, so that you become a little more confident that such an inherently existent I couldn't exist. Because if it did exist, it would have to be inherently one with the body, which has parts, or inherently one with the mind, which has parts. You could do the same thing if you expanded it into 5 aggregates. The form aggregate is like the body. The feelings have different parts. Pleasant feelings, unpleasant feelings, neutral feelings, and so forth. Discriminations are of various kinds, so the different parts of discrimination. So an inherently existent I that's identical with any of the 5 aggregates could not exist.
How about if you said the I is
Just like the
one
thinker.
with
Who's the
the
thinker? The thinker's got the.
oh sorry, I need my other like elbow here. I'm just, like let's say you said, oh, the I is inherently one with the conglomeration of the aggregates.
Right.
Is
So
that
there are other other kinds of fallacies. When we earlier in the text, it mentions there is the reasoning, the king of reasonings, which is the reasoning of dependent arising. And then he talked about 7 points that Chandrakirti brought up, like in analyzing the chariot or the person. So there you would go into, is the chariot one with its conglomeration of parts? Is it one with its shape? And there are other fallacies that arise there, but it is sufficient if you develop the pervasion, if you develop certainty in the pervasion that the inherently existent, if the inherently existent I existed, it would have to be either one with the aggregates or different with the aggregates. Those other 7 points are just to eliminate the kind of qualm that you're having now. Well, maybe there's some other alternative. Maybe it's not, maybe it doesn't have to be one with the aggregates or different with the aggregates. Maybe it could be like one with the conglomeration or one with the shape, the configuration of the body or something else. So those other ones are helped to eliminate those other points. And Paul, I think, is expert on that. That one of his classmates, what was it? Wilson? Was his name Paul? Wrote the seven point analysis.
Joe Wilson.
Joe Wilson, yeah. So Paul shared that booklet with me once. So you can check that in those 7 points. Those other points are addressing that kind of qualm. That kind of qualm comes about because the pervasion that it either has to be one with the aggregates or different than the aggregates was not totally, you didn't reach certainty about that. So then some other kinds of possible, maybe it's one with the conglomeration, the whole, just, the whole set of them or the shape of the aggregates and so forth. So Paul, make sure that Jennifer has access to that booklet. You could read for next.
Yeah, Chandrakirti's 7-point reasoning on the selflessness of persons, old LTWA publication.
Yeah, I'm sure it still exists somewhere.
Oh, I'm sure.
How about anyone else?
Thank you, by the way.
Yeah. Kristen, you have a question? No? Doris? I think Ida has it. Oh, Doris has one. Okay.
I don't have a question, but I liked I's eye is confused.
I's eye, yeah. So, yeah. So these are if you read the great treatises, a lot of these examples are given, but here they're given in a very short way, just on the basis of this ascertainment of the pervasion. So that's a very important thing to investigate. First, the first essential point was identification of the object of negation, seeing that the thing you're trying to establish is whether the I that is believed to be inherently existent, does that actually exist? If it existed, it would have to be either identical to the aggregates or different than the aggregates. That's a second essential point. Then the third and fourth essential points are going into those. It's not establishing that it's not inherently one with the aggregates or the body and mind, and it's not inherently different than the aggregates. So next time we're going to be going more into the other alternative. You can read ahead, get familiar with that. The section that's talking about it's not inherently different than the body and mind for next time. Ida, you have a question? Oh, okay. Ron? Sunny is processing. Larry, you have a question? No? Barbara? Paul? Barbara has.
The one thing that keeps on tripping me up is when I think about, like you were just discussing, when you transmigrate, what part of that is not the I, but yet it's something.
Okay, so what is it? So the I is not the subtlemost mind and wind.
Mm-hmm.
The I is imputed upon, at that point, is imputed upon, the subtlemost I is imputed upon the subtlemost mind and wind.
It's what we humans decided at some point when we were born to believe, the fallacy.
Which fallacy?
That there is an I, that we are separate.
Yeah, that we are. Yeah, it's
separately.
not just that there is an I. There is an I. There is a Barbara, but the Barbara that exists is something kind of rainbow-like. Just the concept Barbara that's given to the appearance of your aggregates.
Okay.
To the mind, to the designated to your body and mind. At the time of death, when the gross mind and gross winds absorb to the subtlemost orb of your heart chakra, whereas it's called the indestructible drop exists, which is the subtlemost mind and subtlemost wind. At that point, the I is imputed upon that subtlemost mind and wind. That wind functions as the form aggregate.
Okay.
Because wind is form as opposed to mind. Form, while we're alive, our body and mind are different, but they're inseparable while we're alive, right?
Mm-hmm.
At the time of death, that subtlemost wind, which functions as the subtlemost body, and the subtlemost mind are inseparable. They can't be separated like at death. So that's like the basis for the subtlemost transmigration of I. We've had from beginningless time that subtlemost mind and wind. Sometimes it expands to a grosser mind in the intermediate state, and then even a grosser mind in a rebirth, then comes down. But there's always that continuity of subtlemost mind and wind. That's not the I.
Okay.
That's the basis to impute the I.
Thank you. Thank you, Venerable.
Okay. Okay. I think we're questioned out. Thank you all for your patience, for chewing these dry bones. See you next week, and read a little bit ahead. And who's that? Violet. Hi. See you next week, okay?